All right, okay. So talking more about macro today and where it came from, I've been through, of course, the micro, the fallacies and the theory of the firm, and then how macro moved from originally, when you look at Hicks's ISLM model, it really was a general equilibrium model. It wasn't a Keynesian model. And this is how Hicks himself realised that he had to make this ridiculous assumption about equilibrium to make it work. So I'll finish off the ISLM bit today and then start about the beginnings of the movement from ISLM to dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, mainly looking at where rational expectations came from, which again actually originated in micro. And that tends to be forgotten for most people who are working in macro today. They just think it's always been done that way. It's one of the weird things of dealing with neoclassicals, they don't know their own history. They don't know they used to do computable general equilibrium. They've all just learned DSGE. They don't know where real business cycles came from, etc., etc. Back to Hicks. So Hicks, when Hicks wrote Mr. Keynes and the Classics, it was supposed to be a book review. That's what it was. He also wrote a paper called Mr. Harrod's Dynamic Theory. That was his attempt to interpret Harrod. Now, in both cases, in the book review, he wrote his own extra models. And those models became regarded, and in one case it came... Let's shut that door. Because now I believe Dom and a few others turning up and opening the door and making strange noises. But in another case, when he wrote Harrod, he took Harrod's model, which was not a very good model mathematically, but had an unstable equilibrium, and the idea of the trend and the cycle being interlinked, to a difference equation which had an equilibrium of 0, and the trade and the cycle being independent of each other. And with Keynes, a similar sort of thing. So he couldn't help himself fiddling and reinterpreting new stuff in his very mathematical way. So if you look at, again, have you looked at Mr. Keynes and the Classics? Yeah. He is attempting to, he has read Keynes, okay, I can't say that he hasn't, but he's read it very much through his own lenses. One of my good colleagues in the whole non-orthodox economics is a guy called Rod O'Donnell from Sydney. Currently he's at University of Technology, but he and I were student stirrers together at Sydney University back when the political economy movement happened there. And Rod and I were giving a seminar once at Australian Economics Conference, and he said to the audience, who were all mainly neoclassical, please don't read Keynes. No, that sounds like the opposite of the advice. He said, every time you guys read it, what I write, I don't even know, what on earth we're looking at. He said, you read Keynes through a lens which so completely distorts the meaning that I don't even recognise what you're writing as any reference to Keynes. And a similar thing applies here. Partly I can quite forgive Hicks on this front for two reasons. One, he recanted later in life. But two, it is a very confusing book. Has anybody here tried to read the general theory? Okay. You have?
I tried.
How'd you go?
First few pages I tried and my concentration slipped.
Yeah. I really recommend, the papers I recommend reading on Keynes are the 1937 papers. Okay, they're short, and he went through like an agonising process of writing the general theory. There were drafts of it in 1933. It was published in 1936. So he's been working on it for about 4 or 5 years. And he was trying to do a grand synthesis. And in some ways, I think the grand synthesis he was after was actually a bit of a backward step, because if you read the preface, part of what he was trying to do was to bring the theory of money back into Marshallian terms. Okay? Now, I think that's just a totally wrong thing to do. But he also, I think I showed you the section last week where he quoted Marx in 33 and then dropped Marx in 36. So the whole political situation meant it was not as clear as he would have liked it to be himself. But the 37 papers, once he'd done the effort, there seemed to be this flowering, and okay, I'm free of having to think about the previous ways of talking. So the 37 papers are the ones you read. But this is Hicks here giving his summary of the general theory. And Keynes calling it the general theory again reflects the milieu of the time when the leading intellect, who was still well and truly alive, was Einstein with his special and general theories of relativity. So here you see Hicks using a similar approach here. Keynes calling his stuff the general theory. Hicks is saying this is the original argument he gave to what he called the special theory. And what he did for the so-called general theory, this is where he starts bringing in his own concepts, his own equations, and calling them Keynes. And so he says for the general theory, here are your equations. You won't find those equations in Keynes. They're invented by Hicks. So this is where he goes well beyond a book review to writing his own logic. So what he's saying is money demand is a function of both income and the interest rates. He uses capital I for income and lowercase I for the interest rate. He then says investment demand is a function of the interest rate and supply of savings is a function of income. Those are the three equations. That became the foundation of ISLM analysis. And here is, again, Hicks with Mr. Keynes in the classics saying really there's not a great deal of difference between them, whereas Keynes, even though he was trying to bring some Marshallian elements in, also thought he was radically overturning previous doctrine. So it is a messy foundation for a new school, without a doubt. And this is my favourite line in Hicks's paper. Is there any difference between them, the classical school and neoclassical? Keynes called what he called the classical school we would call neoclassical today. So any change between the classical school and Keynes, or the whole thing is shamfied, let us have recourse to a diagram. And what has the diagram got? It's a pair of intersecting lines. Okay? That's it. So you're back in the same familiar mental construct of intersecting lines and equilibrium. And rather than supply and demand, what you've now got is the IS curve, which takes the place of the demand curve in micro, and the liquidity LM curve. It's Hicks used LL rather than LM, so some of the notation obviously has changed over time. But that's the replacement for the supply curve in effect. And it's all about where do the lines intersect and how do we get to the equilibrium. But Hicks himself, of course, later realises there's a problem with applying this when you have anything which involves time, which is most of the time, I think. Okay. So he says this one gives you the given quantity of money gives you a relationship between the level of income and the rate of interest. And he draws this upwards sloping because he said with an increase in income you're going to want more money. That's the transactions demand for money. And that's fundamentally the neoclassical vision of why you have money. It's just because you need it for transactions. Okay. So the more transactions, the more money you need to have. Hicks actually has a reverse causation in his alleged classical macroeconomic model. But fundamentally, there's a relationship between the amount of GDP and the amount of money needed, the velocity equation, effectively. And then the interest rate, the higher the interest rate, the more it costs you to hold money, because in this case, money is pretty much regarded as notes, things that don't give you an interest rate return, not like our pathetic deposit rates today. But effectively, money gives you a zero return. So if the interest rate is high, you're paying a cost to have that money in your pocket rather than in a bank where it might earn interest payments. So you get the LM curve out of this. So you draw an axis with the interest rate in the vertical and the supply of money on the horizontal. And of course, the demand for money and the supply of money. Here's the role of seeing the government as being what determines the supply of money. The central bank can easily modify the amount of money. So money supply is exogenous, and that's why it's shown as a vertical line. It's not affected by the relationships in the model. And if we know empirically this is wrong, we know logically it's wrong, but this is the starting point for ISLM analysis. But then you have money demand at an income level of I1. That's your first level of money demand. And then you consider what you can now graph is go across from M to I. Again, the velocity equation will take you from one to the other. So you have the amount of money, a rigid relationship with the amount of GDP, so M to I is fairly straightforward in this vision, a money multiplier type vision. Then you have one point giving you an income level which you've taken from the, let's say it's working out, there's your income level, that comes over here, there's your interest rate on the vertical already, then you've got 1 point on your LM curve. In high, consider a larger amount of high level of money, a higher level of transactions or high level of GDP means you need more money. Therefore, that's going to drive up the interest rate. You then get a second point on your curve, and there's your LM curve, which he called the LL for liquidity, the LM curve. So that's the so-called supply curve, effectively, part of the model. And then with the marginal efficiency of capital argument, he's arguing that there's the level of demand for investment to goods depending upon the interest rate, because the higher the interest rate, the more you're discounting future returns. And the more you discount future returns, the less projects are going to be desirable to invest in. Therefore, you have a lower level of investment with a higher interest rate. But savings is seen as being based on the level of income. So the more savings there is, the more income there is, the more savings. That's your rapid sloping curve. See, because there are two equations used to derive this, there's two equations in the other as well, but it's saying fixed money supply. Okay? One of the equations. This is now saying there's two variable things. So you have investment as a demand function, investment demand as a function of the interest rate. Now, normally if I was going to go into a full course from undergraduate students, I'd be pointing out that the main thing Keynes had determined investment was expectations, not the interest rate. That's completely absent from here. The reason that it's absent, of course, is in Hicks's model, which is the one he's actually building here, not Keynes. In Hicks's model, he's working, as he says later, with a short period of 1 week. And therefore, in 1 week, it makes sense to hold expectations constant. But he's now working with Keynes, allegedly working with Keynes, and Keynes is working with expectations over a year where it's nonsense to hold them constant. That's why he could write the only determinant is the interest rate. He didn't even see Keynes talking about expectations. Okay, and this again is what I mean by you bring your own perspective to looking at exactly the same historical text. So he can look at that and not even see effectively all the discussion Keynes through in expectations. So it's just, he read chapter 12 and just dismiss it. There's nothing of chapter 12, which is all about expectations in this particular rendition of Keynes. So he has investment just as a function of the interest rate and downward sloping. Then you have income and savings as a function of the level of income. So for a low level of income, there's no savings at all. Past a certain point, you have some savings, and the more income you have, the more savings you get out of it. You then have the multiplier taking you from investment to output. So you now have from I to, the other one was from I to M, this is from I to Y as we'd use it today. And you use this single uppercase I, but that's the same as Y in the modern renditions of ISLM. So there you have your relationship, two relationships. You then, with one interest rate combination, you get an income combination as well, the savings from the savings to income function. Another combination, the higher level of income means a higher level of savings. If you get it coming across with a lower level of interest out of this, pardon me, it's too fast, and you get to the IS curve, which effectively is the demand curve in this blown up macro model. So far as Hicks was concerned, he'd now created a rationale for having an equilibrium analysis for the money market. And with an equilibrium analysis for the goods market, he had a model of the macroeconomy. But it was a model which was fundamentally neoclassical, right down to the icon of the intersecting lines. And that was his theory. So what he then says is we have income and interest determined jointly by the intersection of two curves. And in that sense, just as price and output are determined in micro, we get the price and output are determined in macro, just like we have supply and demand determined in micros. And then he says, bang, he's a marginalist. So the whole attempt for Keynes to re-ground economics is gone out the window, and he's saying we're compatible. But there's still got to be some sort of difference, because otherwise it's a sham. So here's the difference. There's your basic ISLM curve. But he now says, how do we actually say anything new about what Keynes has actually said? And he then said it's also possible to show that, yes, a given supply of money determines the relation between income and interest, but it's also possible to say something about this curve. And this is, again, you'll see this turning up in how Paul Krugman interprets the Great Recession. Aggregate demand fell to such a level that we're in the section of the LM curve where boosting the money supply had no effect. And so he said, if you're looking on the left-hand side of the curve, it's likely to be very, very flat. On the right, it's likely to be very steep, because there's some minimum level below which you can't drive the rate of interest. And that's effectively what we now call the zero lower bound, because back then this was hypothetical, now it's actually real. Central banks had said zero interest rates for ages. And secondly, there's a maximum level which you can finance with a given amount of money. But fundamentally, this is also saying the more activity in the economy, if it's already in full employment, you try to boost it, you're going to drive up interest rate and prices. So what he then draws is a diagram like this, where you have the LM curve being very flat, okay, and then the aggregate demand curve, effectively the IS curve. If you're on this region of the LM curve, then there's no point increasing the money supply. You won't change the interest rate, but if you boost demand, you'll get an increase in output without an increase in interest rate. So if you move the IS curve and you're in the Keynesian region, you boost total GDP with very little change in interest rate, hypothetically also not much change in prices. If you're up here in the classical region, any attempt by the government to vary output will cause interest rates to rise and crowd out private sector investment. So he's got this is his argument. In the Keynesian region, if you shift IS to the left, you boost income. In the classical, if you do that, you boost the interest rate. And so we've now reconciled the two. Keynes belongs to the left-hand corner, which makes plenty of sense because he's a lefty. Okay, and the neoclassicals belong to the right-hand side, which also makes perfect sense. So he's saying, again, Hicks says it's a whole family of curves, not just one, but all of them will flatten out at effectively approach the zero lower bound. And if you make any movement here, this is in his illustration from the article, rather than being like a standard supply and demand type drawing on the left, all he said is, well, the supply curve is flat for a while, then it goes vertical. So that's what Keynes was actually reduced to. And that became the basis of a large number of neoclassical models. The post-war period had two classes of models: aggregate supply, aggregate demand models, and ISLM models. The 45-degree line stuff you may have seen in school classes, maybe in some university classes. ISLM is slightly more sophisticated than that, so more equations were added to it, but this was the basis of how neoclassicals and, well, neoclassicals, I'm not going to say Keynesians, neoclassicals were modelling the economy after the Second World War, and more elaborate models to do it, and pretty much saying that Keynes' stuff belongs in the Great Depression, the classical thing belongs when the economy is functioning normally. Well, when you look at neoclassicals defending it today, the neoclassical schools split in all sorts of directions at the moment. You have people, the real business cycle people are pretty much on the back foot. They're going back to micro again. The DSGE people are adding frictions to their model to explain why things didn't return to equilibrium after the financial crisis. Some people like Krugman and Summers are saying, let's go back to ISLM. And he's making, he's defending an equilibrium interpretation of Keynes. And he has got some basis for it. If you look at the general theory, he does actually point later that instability of expectations is what matters, but he says that's what the book is what changed economics. Okay? So let's stick with the book. I'm not asking whether the book is right or wrong, that's the book that changed everything, let's stick to that and ignore the 37 pages. I'd rather ignore the book and stick with the 37 pages because they're so much clearer in the new direction that Keynes was going on. So I was saying Keynes was using a temporary equilibrium, interpreting the state of the economy as if it were a static equilibrium, as a way to clarify thought, just a way of clarifying thought. Okay? And he's Krugman saying he was right to do it. Now I've been trying, I don't know whether Krugman has ever read Hicks's ISLM and explanation. Be intrigued to find. I don't think he has. If he has, he would have dismissed it out of hand, probably. But Hicks, of course, is the author of ISLM, realises after many conversations, particularly with Paul Davidson, the editor of the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, that it wasn't justified to use it as a short-term organising principle. And I just love the way this article starts. The way I describe it in Debunking Economics is it's not an explanation, it's an apology. This is the opening sentence. The ISLM diagram, which is used widely but not universally accepted as a convenient synopsis of Keynesian theory, is a thing for which I cannot deny I have some responsibility. Well, that's an enthusiastic endorsement, isn't it? And what he said was he can no longer accept the idea that there's equilibrium, that you can use equilibrium to organise your thinking about the macroeconomy at the most crucial times in particular. So you see there are three elements. The reason he thought he could, and again he's done the apology and said, yes, it's not Keynes' model, it's my model dressed up as if it were Keynes. And he said Keynes has three elements, goods market, bonds, market for bonds, market for money. Couldn't I model that as a three-way exchange, leaving out one of the three markets under the assumption of Walrasian law? Is what he did. So he had two independent price parameters, price of A in terms of C and price of B in terms of C. And you could derive A as a relative, and you therefore ignore the relative price of A. But he said these two parameters were determined by the equilibrium of two markets, the market for A and the market for B. If these two are in equilibrium, then the third must be also by Walrasian law. But of course the obverse applies. If either of these markets are out of equilibrium, then you can't ignore the third market. Okay. And Hicks doesn't quite state the thing that clearly, but that's what's in the background of that particular paper. Because Keynes appears to have two parameters, his Y and his R. One is not need to bother about the market for loanable funds. Well, it's strange. Hicks chooses some strange things to focus on in his article. I would have said, well, if you choose those two are in equilibrium, you don't need to worry about the market for labour. That's what I'd rather be looking at as a left-out market than the market for loanable funds. In fact, the way that Krugman derives the model is by using loanable funds as part of the argument. But I'd say, well, the third market I'd be looking at is the labour market. Imagine, did people even think, we've got a model of the macroeconomy that leaves out the labour market or derives the labour market, and if you assume, assuming the market's in equilibrium during the Great Depression. So the whole role of equilibrium is essential to the thinking. And you said the intersection of ISML and determines the equilibrium of the system as a whole. Now, when you look at it that way and say, there's equilibrium in the labour market, in the LM market, there's equilibrium in IS, there's only equilibrium in both where they both intersect. Now, if you're not where they both intersect, then Walras' law says they're both out of equilibrium, which means the other markets, if there are any others, and I think workers are necessary for production, then that can also be out of equilibrium, and what you've got is out of equilibrium dynamics. So the only part you can say, the only part of the entire diagram that you can say actually makes any sense as a point for an actual economy is where the two curves intersect. And to believe that's the point that makes sense, you've got to believe the economy is in equilibrium. Okay. So then he says, well, does this make sense? Does it make sense to say, who's he talking about other points along the curve at this stage, saying when you draw the rest of the curve, they're hypotheticals only. They're telling you where you might be if interest rate had been above the point it currently is, the interest rate was higher, below the point where it's lower. But they're theoretical constructions. You can't use them as actual positions the economy is in. Okay? Because when you do some, I'll show you the Cobweb diagram in a short while, and that talks about this is the level of demand, that's the level of supply, and then you move on to the next one and so on. But this is actually saying this is curve derived by presuming equilibrium in a market. For the equilibrium to apply, the other market has to also be in equilibrium. Where you're drawing the line, it's not in equilibrium. So therefore they can't actually be real points in any sense. That's the problem. They're out of equilibrium to begin with. So he said, well, you might imagine they're equilibrium points for a different rate of interests. But if you do, you can't actually say much about them. It's only the point in the intersection where you can say that everything applies. But then for that to apply, you've got to say, well, the economy is in equilibrium. And the year he uses is 1975, because there was a severe downturn in 1975 that was, to my thinking, that the downturn between 74 and 75 was the beginning of a transition from what Minsky would call a tranquil economy to one which is unstable. That's, look globally, that's the point. There was actually a debt bubble that burst that period, 74, 75. It was explained as being caused by the OPEC oil price increase. But in fact, that was a subsequent event to the bursting of a credit bubble. And I'll show you some of the data on that when I start talking about the post-Keynesian approach. But what he said, looking back at that point, people were surprised. Expectations were not fulfilled. And this comes down to the issue, is it realistic to hold expectations stable in a model like this? Yes, if you're talking in terms of a week. No, if you're talking in terms of a year. That's what it starts to realise. So can you treat these deviations from equilibrium as just random or unimportant, etc., etc.? And he said, we tend to do that, but here's really where some wisdom turns up. It's dangerous to think you can treat the economy as always being in equilibrium. There are points in history where it's acceptable to say that, but there are the turning points where it's hardest to accept it. And clearly the one we've been through most recently, 2008. Imagine, well, I'm sure Neoclassicals, I know they have come up with equilibrium explanations of what happened in 2008, but they're nonsense. To say people's expectations were fulfilled, and that's what Hicks comes down to saying, for equilibrium to apply, your expectations must be fulfilled, which means almost plans must be coordinated, which they surely were not. at that period. So he said, if you're not in equilibrium, then the third market, the market you're ignoring, can't be ignored anymore. It's out of equilibrium as well. So if you're going to describe what's happening in that model, even if you think Walras law applies when all markets are in equilibrium, when you're starting out of equilibrium, Walras law means you have disequilibrium in several markets. And so it's the disequilibrium dynamics you need to look at. And this is how Hicks's conclusion that it's a classroom gadget, okay, to be superseded by something better. It's an application of a particular kind of causal analysis where equilibrium methods are not inappropriate, but he's saying at the important times they are inappropriate. So we need to have a non-equilibrium interpretation. He didn't really know what that was going to be. So that was Hicks's own reflection on ISLM further back in time. And of course that's not why Neoclassicals abandoned it. Most of them don't know he wrote this article, for the simple reason it was published in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. And they wouldn't know where to find that in the library, back in the days when you had to go to libraries to find journals. So this is a real pity. I mean, Paul Davidson and I are friends these days, and we've actually spoken about that particular issue. But I wish he didn't told Hicks to submit it to the Journal of Economics or AER, because Neoclassicals need to read this. But Hicks put it as a tribute to Paul in Paul's journal, which was fabulous for Paul. First paper I think it was the first paper in the JPKE by a Nobel Prize winner. Certainly not anybody as famous as Hicks, but it meant he was preaching to the choir, telling post-Keynesians, yes, you're right to have abandoned the neoclassical position, but saying nothing to neoclassicals, but they wouldn't even know the paper was published. So the reasons why it was actually rejected had nothing to do with that issue about equilibrium. But they want to hang on to equilibrium. It wasn't sufficiently neoclassically micro-based, and it implied government policy could work. And they don't like that implication. And some of the literature I was showing you here I think it's quite hilarious when you look at what's the pejorative reason they're doing something. It's not being done because it's a better model of reality. It's because we don't like the conclusions the model leads to. So Lucas there's a period in neoclassical literature where they were incredibly triumphant, pretty much from 1998 to 2007, about 10 years. So they're sure they'd solved all the problems. At this stage, Lucas had just become president of the American Economic Association, and he was giving an extempore speech at the History of Political Economy annual conference. So this is not something he wrote. You look at how it is written. It's a recording of what he said, probably edited a bit to make it. I know what it's like when you speak in public. You look at what you write, and it doesn't look as bad as Donald Trump, but it's still not as eloquent as you'd like it to be. But this has got the feeling of an informal talk. So Patton was absolutely right to try to use general equilibrium to think about macro. Patton and I are both Walrasians, whatever that means. I don't see how anybody cannot be. Okay, so the whole perspective is there's only a Walrasian way to think about the economy, and we should somehow unify macro with micro. Nobody was satisfied with ISLM as the end of macroeconomic theorising. The idea was we were going to tie it together with micro. That was the job of our generation. And in a genuine sense, this is really setting yourself an intellectual objective and achieving it. So I have no qualms about the intellectual drive behind the whole thing. It's just that it's all totally wrongly founded. So when you look to how they turn macro into applied microeconomics, the starting point was, of course, micro. And there's a character who's been not forgotten in neoclassical circles. In fact, I went to the speech at the session of the American Economic Review some years ago, which was the anniversary in 2011, the 50th year of the history of the Muth paper. And all the people congratulating themselves on rational expectations. The one person who threw any criticism into the whole thing was Robert Schiller, who was pointing out the flaws in using this logic, but all of them were saying 50th year of rational expectations. And somebody, I've forgotten who answered the question, but somebody charged out, do you think we'll still be using rational expectations in 100 years? And the basic answer was a very confident yes. This, by the way, is 3 years after the financial crisis. So when you look at where the idea of rational expectations came from, it was applied to what's called the hog cycle or the cobweb cycle. Have you any of you seen that at all? Okay. I'll take you through the basics. Again, I would have liked it in more detail here, but there's a reasonable amount of detail. So what it was an equilibrium model. So the price fluctuations that were known to occur in what's called the hog cycle, the price you pay for, I don't know, pig carcasses. There's some weird products that are traded in American futures exchanges, and one of them is, I've forgotten the expression they use, but it's hog something or other. So it's called the hog cycle. And that's the cycle of prices over time from 2000 to 2016, booms and busts. I'm not quite certain. I don't know what the 1.3 stand for in this particular chart. This is taken straight from the futures exchange or the commodity exchange. So big booms and busts in the price cycles, but they always seem to fall back to much the same level. And this has been going on for well over a couple of hundred years, I think. And now if you look at it, if you're a systems dynamics person, you look at it and you'll see, well, there's several things which are out of phase here, and that's why those cycles keep on recurring. So you have the price of the pigs, the inventory, the number of pigs that are actually available for sale as animals to be slaughtered rather than animals to breed, and the rate of production, the new pigs that are coming along. So you have price rising as production for slaughter falls. So if you actually have a downward trend in production, then that's likely to give an upward trend in price. As the increases in price reduce demand, then your inventory of unsold animals is likely to rise because production takes time. So demand will start to fall as prices are rising, and then production will be increasing as demand is falling because it takes a year or so or 2 years to breed pigs to the stage where you can slaughter them. So it's all the time sequences. And then demand will fall because the new supply reverses the price rises and you're back into the same old situation again. So the cycle looks like this from a system dynamics point of view. There's a price cycle, an inventory cycle, and a production cycle. They're all affecting each other, but they're all out of phase, partly for the simple reason that you can't grow a pig in a day. Okay? And so what your decisions have time lags to them, and they will interact in a complex cycle like this. And this is the beginnings of a production, a model of the system dynamics model of the same cycles. Now, that was put into a neoclassical disequilibrium micro model back in 1938 by Ezekiel, and it was called the Cobweb theorem. And you can see it's one of the top-ranking journals, so it had a fairly major impact. And the idea was that you have a low supply to the market in 1 year, then you're going to have a high price. With the high price, that'll encourage much more supply the next year, and therefore be a glut which depresses price. Now, it's still using the same basic idea of an upward sloping supply curve, and you know I went through trashing that earlier in the course. But that's, once you draw those diagrams of rising supply price and falling demand price, then you can get a cycle out of the actual structure saying demand occurs first, the level of demand determines the price that's occurred. Okay, that's where the sales actually occur on the demand curve. And then if the price is high, large supply next year, and then you find, the next hog cycle, the next round of sale of hogs, you're discretizing everything here. And what you get is what looks like a cobweb. So this is the pattern. You can have a permanent cycle. So you go, if you just imagine you've drawn them in such a way that you go from the demand price 1 year to the supply price the next, meaning there's huge supply so demand is low, meaning that next year you get low supply so the price is high. You can get that pattern occurring permanently. Or you converge to equilibrium, so you spiral in over a few years, or you diverge to bigger cycles. And this is the way that Ezekiel showed it. You start, you can see you're starting at, he's only got P2 and Q3 there. You start with a quantity in year 2 there. That gives you the price in year 2, because that means that's the amount of stock being supplied to the market. So bang, you get up here to the high. Well, that's the price in year 2. That leads to a high supply in year 3. That's where P1 is down here. So the low price supply next year is low, and off you go. You just continue repeating the cycle. That's one way of seeing it. But you can have a possibility of them spiraling out or spiraling in. And since this is written in 1938, you're in the middle of the end of the Great Depression. The whole emphasis on equilibrium has been not shattered, but certainly given a bit of a challenge. So people are willing to think in non-equilibrium terms. And if you read this article, he's saying that classical theory presumes you'll return to equilibrium. But this model shows that even if you have unchanging demand and supply curves, that won't necessarily happen. You might fluctuate indefinitely, diverge further and further. It's quite possible. Okay? So it's willingness to entertain a non-equilibrium interpretation of supply and demand curves. And that would have been something that, when you look at the way that the original founders of neoclassical economics worked, they would have been quite happy about that. Because when you read Jevons, Marshall, Clark, to some extent Volra, definitely Menger, they're happy to say, well, we're only doing equilibrium because we don't have the tools for non-equilibrium in the 19th century. So here's Jevons in 1871 saying, we wanted to do a complete solution which treated as a problem of dynamics. But why do we do statics? Because it would be absurd to attempt the more difficult question when the more easy one is yet so imperfectly within our power. Okay, so we can do it, but we know we're doing a stepping stone to what the full analysis should be. Marshall saying, I can challenge all of these statements, by the way, in terms of the logic of them, but the basic idea is statics is part of dynamics. Okay? Statical solutions are a subset of a dynamic system. Drop the equilibrium, you've got to have a more realistic position. And he's saying again the same thing. It's a provisional step towards problems that where we can't currently do a complete dynamical. So let's hope we'll do dynamics. And my favourite of all is J.B. Clark, the guy who invented the Marshall productivity theory of income distribution. He, in 1898, was asked to reflect on what's going to happen in the next century. And the intriguing thing was, here is what was going to happen. We're going to be solving dynamic problems. We're going to abandon statics, fundamentally meaning abandoning the crutch of assuming everything happens in equilibrium. We're going to go to dynamics next century. And he makes some very good cases about this. Some of his logic is wrong, but basically saying the static state is imaginary. All societies are dynamic, and unceasing changes in the actual wealth thrust labour and capital out of one occupation into another. In each industry, carried on again, then changes in mode of production, time. That's excellent. That's what we should be doing. Okay? But this is the vision that he thought would be happening in the 20th century. Now, he was wrong to say that dynamics would not contradict statics, because when you look at it, the dynamic stuff doesn't, dynamics doesn't contradict statics if static equilibrium is stable. I've already shown you two situations where that's false within neoclassical theory, the Perron-Frobenius theorem for production and the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Haber theorem for demand curves. So he thinks we've got to do the statics first, but he thought in the 20th century we'd start doing dynamic analysis. So Walras method, yes, you can work at equilibrium price and quantity vectors, but the Perron-Frobenius theorem tells you they're unstable. And I remember sitting through a seminar where a guy who I ultimately supervised him to finish his PhD, one of my colleagues at Western Sydney, he was doing a computable general equilibrium model, I think of the Hungarian economy, and his supervisor came out from the States and was talking about his own CG model, and at one point remarked he was really quite proud that it would be stable for five iterations. I don't think he realised why it was unstable, because if you generate this with a linear set of price equations, you'll get negative prices coming out after 5 steps because of that instability, the Perron-Frobenius instability. Now we then have this idea of Hicksian demand curves being downward sloping, but we know from Sonnenschein-Mantel-Haber that any polynomial shape at all is feasible for a demand curve derived from neoclassical first principles. So you can't do equilibrium analysis there because you're going to have multiple points of intersection. Now, rather than abandoning equilibrium as an organising way of thinking about the economy, which is what they should have done, it instead became a belief about the nature of the economy and the nature of science too. So here's Jorgensen, who's the one who first published for economists the results of the Perron-Frobenius theorem. And his starting point to avoid dual instability. Why not to come to grips with it? Why not to acknowledge it? So he just had to reinterpret Walras' original set of mechanisms. So he's trying to hang on to equilibrium there, rather than saying, well, found it unstable, therefore that logically means that prices we see in the market must be non-equilibrium prices. How do we build models of non-equilibrium prices? That would have been the sensible way to react to that discovery. And then my favourite here is by a guy called Ed Lazare, Very nice bloke. I met him in Adelaide in 2000, I think it was, or not a bit after 2000. 2008, pardon me, I think it was. He was, no, 2010 it would have been. He was George Bush's chief economic advisor. Not a good position to be in when the market falls apart on you. And the funny thing is, he wrote this very, very triumphant paper in 2000, Economic Imperialism, published in the QJE, which is one of the leading conservative journals. And clearly, it's like this is the heroic stage of neoclassical theory. They're quite confident they understand the real world. When I met him in 2010, he gave the keynote speech in Adelaide for the Australian Economic Association conference. He's a decent guy, very nice guy. We had a good chat after he gave his speech. And he actually said, look, what did I know about macroeconomics? I'm a labour market specialist. So at the time, he didn't think there was anything wrong about being a labour market specialist as George Bush's chief economic advisor, because it solved all the big macro questions. Now it's a case about making markets more efficient. So of course the labour market economist should be chief macroeconomic advisor. When this hit him in the face, he couldn't say that anymore. But back in 2000, this was an incredibly confident paper. And I wanted you to look at what they see as defining the nature of economics, because it's when they're most confident that they say what they actually believe. Now at the moment, because they're not confident, you'll get all sorts of obfuscations about whether equilibrium is or is not part of their thinking. But this was published in the QJE, very, very leading conservative journal, by the guy who was Bush's chief economic advisor not long after this was written, at a time when they thought they'd solved all the major problems. And here's how they define why economics is the only true social science. First of all, rational individuals who engage in maximising behaviour, so that's one side of being a science. Secondly, it adheres strictly to the importance of equilibrium as part of any theory. Yes, there are some parts of science that use equilibrium, okay? If you look at the idea of thermodynamic equilibrium, things of that nature, yes, okay, maybe. But no way do scientists impose equilibrium on their models of the physical world in the same way that economists impose it on economics. And then efficiency. Those three things. It doesn't define a science to me, that defines a mythology. So we have the Cobweb cycle being devised by Ezekiel back in the 30s, implying instability, non-equilibrium. We can't have that. How do we get rid of the idea of equilibrium? This is where Muth comes in, with a technically quite challenging paper for its time, where he says, I can give you an equilibrium explanation for the Hogg cycle. It's not non-equilibrium at all. It's exogenous shocks moving a supply curve along a stable demand curve. And he starts on this point, I should like to suggest that expectations, since they are informed predictions of future events, are essentially the same as the predictions of the relevant economic theory. That's the starting point. Now, Keynes sent up his neoclassical predecessors for the way they treated uncertainty. That I accuse the classical economic theory of being one of these pretty polite techniques which tries to deal with the present by abstracting from the fact that we know very little about the future. Classic Keynes piece of eloquence. But what you got with Muth is saying, well, we now presume we can predict the future. Not that we ignore we don't know anything about it and build our models that way. We now assume we can predict the future using economic theory. So, you look at Keynes when he's saying what was done by the neoclassicals of his day, and this is pretty much what you see in Hicks, Hicks's own interpretation. Expectations were given. Okay. And risk is ignored. You presume probability calculus can bring uncertainty back to the same calculable status as certainty itself, which actually finally happened with de Broglie. But he said, actually, as a rule, we have only the vaguest idea of anything but the most direct consequences of our acts, which is quite accurate. This is a statement of reality. And in fact, this is why I often point to Austrians who rabbit on about how bad Keynesians are and therefore how bad Keynes is. If I showed them that statement as to who wrote it, they'd most likely volunteer it was Hayek. Okay? But Keynes definitely saying we've got very little knowledge about what's going on. He then says uncertainty doesn't mean distinguishing what is probable from what is not. It's about things we simply have no capacity to know. If you're more sophisticated than that, you can make approximations to it, in my opinion. But But that's the starting point. You simply can't you can't assume you can predict the future. But this is how Muth went about justifying it. And again, I find this quite hilarious because people just take this, because it fits into their mindset, they accept it without criticizing some of the logical foundations. They're saying the hypothesis is that expectations of firms, or subjective probability, what people think is going to happen, are distributed about theory or the objective. Let one sink in for a moment. He said it asserts three things. Now, the first one is my favourite. Information is scarce, and the economic system generally does not waste it. And he has a thing about the formation of expectations, public predictions, and so on. But this one here, if you say, what he's saying is the predictions of the theory are the objective probability distribution of incomes. In other words, the theory is an accurate description of reality. Okay, stage one. This one is saying that something is both scarce and free. That's a non sequitur. The neoclassical theory tells you that if something is scarce and valuable, okay, it's going to have a price. If it has a price, how much will you demand of it? Well, if you're a rational person, you'll buy it until such time as the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost. Okay? Will you therefore consume infinite amount of information? Of course not. You're going to have incomplete information. You're going to buy less information than is necessary to be accurate about the future because it's not worth your while to do it. So what this implies is expectations are going to be wrong. Not hugely wrong in this particular framework, okay, because you'd be close to, but not on the equilibrium. So it's a reason to say you can't do equilibrium analysis. But they just simply look at that line, information is scarce. Oh, that's true. Yeah, okay, so we're going to use it then, aren't we? Information about the future. Okay. And I'm quoting the editor of the Journal of Economics, the American Journal of Economics Macro, in a rejection note to me. What if they get more information about the future? How will that change things? Information about the future. Okay. So I've got this good mate of mine who owns a DeLorean car, flies in every now and then, told me it's going to happen 20 years in advance. We all got that. So what you get is everything's now equilibrium. This is beginning with the Cobweb cycle model. Though he's defined it as deviations from equilibrium now. So we've got a demand curve which is only negative because you're at equilibrium. So if price is above, demand's going to fall. If price is below, demand's going to rise. An equation for supply, and then saying the actual amount, the amount sold. P does not stand for price, it stands for production, which is a bit confusing. But production will be equal to the demand level. That's what's going to be sold. And then what you get is you feed that price in, and you're saying the expected price is the price predicted by the theory. Again, I would like to have done more detail on this, but we haven't had time with that. Oh, that was good. Hang on. Obviously, I didn't. This is the fun stuff I've got to do when I'm putting a set of slideshows together, and there's clearly a yeah. I better move that down one. Let's try that again on the instant replay. Okay. Display settings. Okay. Duplicate. Okay. Boom. I'm doing really well today, aren't I? Okay. It's the rationality assumptions that it applies is the expected price equals the equilibrium price. Okay. In other words, so where you're going to expect to be, which is what you produce to, is on the demand curve. The supply curve will be on the demand curve. So all points are equilibrium points. So how do you explain the cycle exogenous shocks? Okay. And that's at the micro level, that's explaining the hog market, but everything is driven by exogenous shocks. And so we're back into the world where there is no internal dynamics, all dynamics occur along equilibrium. And Muth was the beginning of it. I think actually, from what I remember, I think one of the Lucas or Rapping or that crowd were flatmates with Muth as a graduate student. So this stuff all comes out of the community in which they grow up in. And they were, they thought it was so sophisticated, stunning paper. How do we bring this across to macro? Well, they brought it across to macro by attacking Friedman, which is amusing because Friedman, of course, attacked Keynes in the first place. So Keynes used the idea of what's called adaptive expectations, not rational now, not predicting the future, but expectations which adapt over time to past history. And he used that as a way of trying to demolish Keynes. So he began with, this is a paper called The Optimal Quantity of Money. And he begins by assuming the economy is already at what he called the natural rate of unemployment. So you're at the equilibrium point, and economic policy is trying to drive it below that point. Now, economic policy began in the 1930s, and I don't think you can call the 1930s a period when the economy was at the natural rate of unemployment, 25%. But this is how it's recast. So he shows that back with inflation on the vertical axis and unemployment on the horizontal, and there's some natural rate of unemployment where there's zero expected inflation to begin with. Then you have the government increasing the money supply, which people interpret as an increase in demand. And because of that increase in demand, they work harder and produce more output. But because of diminishing marginal productivity, you get rising prices coming out of that. You moved up the supply, up the marginal cost curve. So bang, you suddenly find yourself hitting a higher inflation rate now. Your target rate of unemployment is below the natural rate. And then because of that high inflation, over time you adapt and realise that in fact it wasn't a higher level of demand in real terms, just a high level of money-based demand. So production falls back to the pre-existing natural rate with a higher rate of inflation. So the government does it again, and you get a higher expectations level. And what you get is a Phillips curve that moves out. So the short-run Phillips curves that move out, as the money supply grows too quickly, there's a long-run vertical in the Phillips curve. So that was demolishing demolishing Keynes. We might take a break because you're all going for a break now. I've been going for a solid for an hour. Let's take a bit of a break and then, yeah. Okay, so I head off, go to the bathroom. I was trying to stop that. Phillips curve. Accelerating inflation, if you try to drive the level of money supply up to drive up economic activity, and that's our basic idea from Friedman. That's where the idea of the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment came from, this particular paper. Okay, which is, to me, it's another myth being measured by neoclassical economists. So the idea of short-run gain, long-run pain, you shouldn't do it. But it's still accepted that monetary factors can have real effects. Okay, because in the transition, if you increase the money supply, you get a lower level of unemployment and a higher level of output. Now, if you keep on doing it, you can continuously maintain the unemployment rate below the natural rate. And that's the point of attack that the rational expectations macroeconomists, as they were defining themselves at the time, that's their point of attack, because they said, if you look at what's going on, and here he says, to an economist, see the cyclical correlation between real output and prices from a volatile aggregate demand schedule tracing out a relatively stable upward sloping supply curve. That's in fact the opposite of what Muth was doing in his model of the hog cycle. He said that leaves a little dilemma, because the absence of money illusion, we assume people work in real terms, not nominal, that implies a vertical aggregate supply curve. So the fluctuations in demand should cause price levels to change without changing output. So how do we explain it from this point? Well, so we absolve it by a refined view of the decision problem facing agents, in which short-run supply behaviour differs from long-run under perfect information. That's adaptive expectations. So agents don't react to price changes they think are going to be temporary, but they do react to ones they think are going to be permanent. And then it's this question whether a change is temporary or permanent or not. But that wasn't okay for Lucas, because what it implies was you can't get the natural rate hypothesis. The natural rate says, well, you're basically saying we're always at the natural rate, or you can't drive us below the natural rate. But the whole idea, if you were willing to tolerate accelerating inflation, you could keep the economy permanently below the natural rate, and therefore monetary changes would have real effects. And what they were trying to rule out was not empirical data that didn't fit the current theory, but a theory that didn't fit the empirical data. They didn't want to have this idea that you could be out of equilibrium. So he said rational expectations are preferred to adaptive, not because it fits the empirical record, but because it's the only way to say monetary policy can't change the real level of output. And the essence of it is that you have a model which can predict the future, And this is again Keynes's point that the essential fallacy in neoclassical economics is about knowledge of the future. And just to why adaptive expectations doesn't rescue macro, but that's what the reason that Friedman put that model forward was to trash the idea that you had a trade-off on the Phillips curve. You're saying that the Phillips curve actually moves out. So there isn't a nice menu choice between high inflation and low unemployment, or low inflation and high unemployment. If you try to drive it below the natural rate, you'll get accelerating inflation, no changing unemployment rate. That was what Friedman was trying to do. But Lucas said we can get an aggregate supply function that gets rid of this problem. The logic is here. So first of all, what he's defining here, the log of output being a constant minus the gap between expected prices and equilibrium prices. And these are both, again, as Muth was doing it, these are the Y and the P are both deviations from equilibrium, not the actual of the deviation from equilibrium. So, and for the logs, the basic reason for logs is when you differentiate the logs, you get the percentage rate of change. So that's why the logs are used in the paper rather than just using straight values. So I didn't write this animation this slide here. But if you then differentiate the log of output, you get the rate of change of output, and that's going to be the differential of the constant. This is a difference equation, not a difference equation, a first order time lag equation here. So you then have its constant times the rate of change. The rate of change of the deviation of output from equilibrium, okay, is some constant times the rate of change of the deviation of actual price from the rate of change of equilibrium prices. So you will be out of equilibrium if that gap that'll be zero. In other words, you'll be on equilibrium if this is zero. Now, that's saying the only way that's going to be zero would be if the actual rate of inflation is the expected rate of inflation. Okay? And that's what he does. If you have adaptive setting of prices, then you get this process that there's as you know, is working in difference equations here, and a slow process of getting there, and what you get for the deviations can be permanent. Okay? You can get permanent deviations from the equilibrium level of output, which you didn't want. So you get, this is logs, of course, and also equilibrium applications being done. It's simplified to that factor. And with the deviations from long-term and trend, you can get a permanent deviation from long-term trend if expected inflation is lower than actual inflation. And that's a problem. They don't want that to be possible, but that's saying nominal factors have real effects. So it promises unlimited real output gains from a well-chosen inflationary policy. Even a once-off will increase output over the infinity of transition periods. Okay, so actually, as I've shown you in the adaptive expectations model, it's still allowing that nominal factors can have real effects. Now, that should be an interesting intellectual question. Do they? But instead what they're saying is we can't have that. That doesn't fit our theory. So how do we get rid of it? And here's, again, reasons why Lucas rejected adaptive expectations. It implies that you can get symmetrically biased expectations that lead to a positive return from inflationary policy. So they permit short-run and long-run trade-offs, which we don't want to have in our theory. So the solution is to replace adaptive expectations, which is effectively delayed learning, with rational expectations, which are immediate, accurate forecasts of the future. And that's the way they'd write. They sometimes put it that blatantly. And my favourite is here. This is from Lucas. I think this is the paper that actually gave rise to what's called the Lucas critique, which people focus upon and say that's a valid reason for criticising macro models. Even Marxist friends of mine will come up with statements like that on occasions. But they miss this little bit, saying the hypothesis of adaptive expectations was rejected as part of the natural rate hypothesis. In other words, the hypothesis that there is a natural rate for the economy, on the grounds that under some policies, the gap between actual inflation and expected inflation was positive or non-zero. But if the impossibility of that is taken as an essential feature of the natural rate hypothesis, and this is my punchline, one is led into adding the assumption that expression 6 is 0 as an additional axiom. Simply. Let's simply assume that people accurately predict future inflation. There's nothing simple about that. There's something simple-minded about believing that's a way to construct a theory. But it's presuming that people always accurately predict the rate of inflation from government policy, of course, government policy causing the inflation, or to assume that expectations are rational in the sense of Muth. That's saying that this is why I love finding quotes like this. This is an equivalence between assuming that people can predict the future or saying rational expectations, which means rational expectations assumes people can predict the future. They've never quite put it that way in their own writing, but here's one of those little gimme statements that comes up. And they then say, well, the economic policy is going to be ineffective if this happens. What's going on here? So, okay. So when they applied it to the idea of can you actually take advantage of the Phelps curve, this is another paper, not the same one by Lucas as I was showing a moment ago. The public knows the feedback rule, what the monetary policy is doing, takes it into account in forming its expectations. Therefore, changes in the money supply, which are anticipated, can't do anything. Only the ones people don't expect can. So if you remove the assumption that the authority can trick the public, that's what's going on, tricking you, the public, not increasing aggregate demand, tricking the public. And that's done by rational expectations. Precisely accomplishes that. And what that means is the authority cannot expect to plot the Phillips curve for even one period. So in other words, government policy can never be effective, which of course you could raise lots of counter examples to. But the sheer enthusiasm they had for this role, this was the way to get rid of nominal factors having any impact upon the real economy. And that's the way it was designed. I think that's pretty much where I ran out of time. So I've got to go into that next week. But what I'll be doing is going back to your piece of reading right now, because partly what they've done is reject ISLM. They put forward a rational expectations model of some description, but it was still pasted onto a conventional macro framework. They wanted to build their own from first foundations, and they found it in Ramsey's paper on the optimum savings rate. And then that became the basis of real business cycle models, which then finally became DSGE models. So I'll turn off the recording because I'm feeling